Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this overview of study designs. In several previous videos, we've talked about different study designs that can be used in evidence-based public health. And so in this video, I'd like to bring all of those together and point out some of the kind of interesting things that they share or ways that they are different and why we use them in different ways. So most of the study designs that we use are on the individual level. The data are collected on the individual level. And so let's start there. On the left-hand side of the graph, we have this group called bunch of cases. So we have a bunch of cases that are collected on the individual level, and this is known as a case report. If there is only one case that we're studying, or a case series, if we are looking at several different cases together. And this is often where research on a particular topic will start, because we notice something interesting about this case or about these cases that we haven't noticed before. And so that is a lot of times the first thing that we notice about a particular relationship between variables. The next kind of study that often happens is a cross-sectional, and this is where we collect all of the data at once. If we have an exposure and an outcome, those are both measured at the same time. We basically have a survey or a questionnaire, or we can collect data from individuals by taking their blood. A lot of different ways that we can collect data, but we collect it all on the same day. And because of that, we have certain things about that study that are valuable. We'll come back to this one once we've filled out this whole entire table. Now, we can also do cross-sectional studies on the group level, and those are called ecological studies. And the thing that I like to point out that sometimes can be confusing is ecological studies are almost always just cross-sectional in nature. They're like a cross-sectional study, except the data that we're collecting is on the group level. So here we have the ecological, and so when you're asked a question about, what type of study is this, as soon as it's on the group level, then we think of that as an ecological study. The next kind of subgroup, we're actually looking at longitudinally over time. So we usually collect information. The exposure and the outcome happen at different times instead of being all at once. And so for both of these, and actually all three of them, we're looking at separation in time between the exposure and the outcome. For this first one, we have a bunch of cases. We find a bunch of cases, and then we find a bunch of non-cases to compare them to, and that is very aptly called a case control study. So the cases are based on knowing what the outcome of that particular study is, and so we're looking back in time to see what the exposure is. So these cases can be rare cases, and so that makes this a particularly good design for that particular type of outcome. The next type of study design, we have a group of people that's known as a cohort. And here we have the exact same thing happening. And so here we have what's called a cohort. C-O-H-O-R-T. So both of these are cohort studies. We have a group of people. We look to see if they're exposed versus not exposed. And then we follow them forward in time to find out if they become a case or not. And so this right here, group of people, that's just code for cohort. And specifically, Here we have a group of people who's exposed versus not exposed, and we're just watching them. That's called observational. If I do the exact same kind of study, except the investigator assigns the exposure, that's called experimental. And we'll learn about that in another video that's coming up here in a little bit. So we have an observational cohort versus an experimental cohort. Now, if we're assigning the exposure, then all of these by definition need to be prospective. However, with observational, we can have both prospective or retrospective. And the only difference is the timing in which we're having the collection of data. With retrospective, we're looking back in time to find out when that exposure happened. And with a prospective observational cohort, the exposure is probably happening currently, and then we're waiting for the outcome to occur. The other thing that you should know about experimental cohorts is that if we're studying something where people are sick, often that's called a clinical trial. Whereas if we're studying people who are well and we're trying to prevent something bad from happening, that's called a field trial. There's also something called, I don't have room for another one, I'll just put it right here, quasi-experimental. And that's any time, and I've seen this used in a variety of different ways. That's any time one feature of what's typically thought of as an experimental version of a cohort study is not quite the same way we would normally think of it. Usually, we randomize each individual to different arms, or we are looking at something that the investigator themselves have assigned. And so we'll, in another video, we'll take a look at how quasi-experimental kind of fits into the big picture. But just realize that they still are experimental cohorts, and so we treat them the same way in terms of the way we analyze them, the way we describe them. Basically, we've taken a sample from the population, and then we follow them to see if they become cases or not at some time in the future. So that's the overview. And one of the things that I like to point out is that often, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but often when we first notice something, we start at the beginning and we kind of progress through to gain more and more and more evidence. We don't start off usually with a clinical trial or an experimental cohort study design. We usually do the kinds of things where we're looking at hypothesis generating early on, and then once we have a much more solid idea of the relationship that we're looking at, then we'll put the money into either observational or experimental cohort studies, because those can be quite expensive, and we want to have a very solid idea of the exact question that we're asking, because once we get to that point, we want to use our money very wisely. So over time, when we understand the relationship better, we'll use the more in-depth study designs. Also, a lot of people will say that the strength of evidence goes up as we go from left to right. Sorry, that was an alarm on my phone. So the strength of evidence with case reports or case series isn't very strong, and that's because we don't really have a group to compare that to. So we can say what has happened for those particular cases, but we don't know if what we're looking at just happens to be something that would happen over time anyway. or if that's something that is due to the relationship between exposure and outcome that is really there. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people would say that the items here are hypothesis generating only. Here in the middle we have both hypothesis generating and hypothesis testing. And when we get over here to the right, we have hypothesis testing. We don't want to expose somebody, assign somebody to some exposure without having a really, really good reason to, and having a solid study design that we know we can answer the question that we're interested in understanding. So those are kind of some basic overall overarching generalizations when you put them in this particular format. The other thing is that the studies over here on the left-hand side tend to take less time and money. And over here, kind of like on the right-hand side, we have more time and money. For the reason that a lot of times over here on the left, some of this data may already exist. We may already have things like common cross-sectional study is the YRBS. Common ecological study is like country data or state demographics, those kinds of things that we get from the census and that sort of thing. So we may already have that data and we're just looking at it in a new way. With case control, because this is always retrospective, by definition the outcome has already occurred because it's retrospective. So these two are retrospective, these two are prospective. Let me erase that. I'll get rid of this. Because they're retrospective, anytime something is retrospective, we are at the mercy of recall bias. If the outcome has already occurred, then we need to be really, really careful that we're gathering the information from the people who have disease, the cases, and the people who are non-cases in a similar sort of way. So we can see some similarities as soon as we kind of map it out this way. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages based on the key features that we see of those study designs. The other thing that I really want to explicitly point out is that here in the case control, we are collecting information. Let me use a different color. We are collecting information about cases. What that means is that we can find rare cases. Cases are outcomes. Their outcome is the same as disease. So in a case control study, we can look at rare disease, but we can study lots and lots of exposures, and specifically you can only look at common exposures, especially if this is a small study. If we only have a few cases, it's very unlikely that we will be able to look at rare exposures. On the other hand, here with the cohort studies, we can look at rare exposures or any kind of environmental factor. So we can look at rare chromosomal features that people might have. So, but in this case, we can look at many, many outcomes. We can commonly only study common outcomes of disease unless this cohort is extremely large. But a couple of examples of those in this case control study, remember we looked at in utero exposure to certain substances, and it's possible that that only happened to a very small number of pregnancies. So in utero exposure. yeah. So we have very few who had the outcome that we were interested in, vaginal cell carcinoma. And so we wanted to see what are all of the different kinds of exposures that could have happened. Did the moms have a common occupation? Did they all take a certain drug? That kind of thing. With the cohort studies, a common adverse health study is a great example of a cohort study where we collect up a large group of people, we follow them forward in time. Also Framingham. And so we can look at rare exposures if we were to specifically select that group of rare exposures. And a lot of times these are done retrospectively. So here, Advent's Health Study in Framingham, or the prospective version. Retrospectively, we could look at, say, asbestos exposure, or the example that we gave of the radium dial painters. And so these are both occupational, since not very many people in the population have that particular occupational exposure, we can look at rare exposures. But we can also look and see many, many different outcomes that occur due to those exposures. Case control can, by definition, only look at one outcome, and it can be a rare one. Whereas with a cohort study, we can look at a rare exposure and we can look at many, many outcomes. So those are kind of some differences. With a cohort study, we can only look at the risk factors that were measured at the beginning of the study. And so even if we have a great idea, if we don't have anything recorded about the exposure at the beginning, we can't study that particular thing. So that's where we end up with multiple versions of studies over time. So that concludes my overview of study designs. I hope that has been helpful, and thank you so much for joining me.